Tonight on KQED Newsroom, Congressman Adam Schiff joins us to discuss the Kavanaugh Supreme Court nomination and other news from Capitol Hill. And this November, California voters will be choosing a new governor. We'll talk to Democratic candidate Gavin Newsom about his vision. Plus, how a new investigative journalism startup is aiming to hold big tech companies accountable. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. We begin with the bitter fight over the U.S. Supreme Court. Today, the Senate Judiciary Committee voted along party lines to advance Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to the full Senate floor. Although Republican Arizona Senator Jeff Flake voted yes, he called for the FBI to look into the allegations. The GOP later agreed, and President Trump ordered an investigation that would be limited in scope and completed in less than 1 week. These developments come just one day after a riveting hearing where the country watched Dr. Blasey Ford accuse Judge Kavanaugh of sexually assaulting her when they were in high school.
I believed he was going to rape me. I tried to yell for help. When I did, Brett put his hand over my mouth to stop me from yelling. This is what terrified me the most and has had the most lasting impact on my life. It was hard for me to breathe, and I thought that Brett was accidentally going to kill me.
Judge Kavanaugh has denied the allegations, but this time he did so with anger. He railed against Democrats for trying to sink his nomination and destroy his name.
This whole 2-week effort has been a calculated and orchestrated political hit, fueled with apparent pent-up anger about President Trump and the 2016 election, fear that has been unfairly stoked about my judicial record, revenge on behalf of the Clintons, and millions of dollars in money from outside left-wing opposition groups.
To discuss all of this is Congressman Adam Schiff. He joins me via Skype from Washington, D.C. Congressman Schiff, nice to have you back.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
What else would you like to see happen before a full Senate vote happens?
Well, look, as a prosecutor, and there are a number of Republicans on that committee that have done investigations and prosecutions before. When you have two witnesses who have contradictory stories and both of them cannot be telling the truth, you don't simply shrug and say, okay, we're going to choose to believe this person, choose to believe that person. You go and you interview and you bring under oath other witnesses. Now, there's no reason in the world why you would not bring in Mark Judge, put him under oath, have him testify, why you would not bring in Brett Kavanaugh's classmate from Yale, who has a similarly disturbing story to tell about Brett Kavanaugh and his behavior while drunk. There's no reason you wouldn't bring them in unless you don't really want to hear what they have to say. So the Senate could get to the bottom of this. Any prosecutor worth their salt, anyone who's ever had a case where you had two conflicting witnesses can say, you don't simply leave it at that. You do further investigation. And the idea that somehow the Republican Senate staff, whose mission is to confirm this guy, are going to be objective investigators is laughable.
And I should point out that Mark Judge is the other person that Blasey Ford said was in the room at the time when she alleges Brett Kavanaugh assaulted her. And when you're speaking about the truth, I want to ask you, based on your experience as a former prosecutor, what are your thoughts on the process and format of yesterday's hearing? The 5-minute chunks of questioning, no other witnesses were called. Was that conducive to eliciting truth?
No, it wasn't. And, I think we saw graphically when the all-male Republicans on the Judiciary Committee brought in a woman prosecutor to question Dr. Ford. It seemed odd, on the one hand, why are you bringing in a prosecutor to essentially cross-examine the victim? Usually the prosecutor is on the side of the victim. But here, the prosecutor questioned the victim. And then when it got to Brett Kavanaugh, who the prosecutor should be questioning and should be cross-examining, they cut her off, and the senators jumped in with their political speeches. So it was, I think, all too transparent a display of politics rather than getting to the truth.
Well, you're accusing the Republicans of playing politics, but the same criticisms have been leveled at the Democrats. In fact, yesterday during the hearing, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham launched a scathing attack on Democrats, saying, quote, "What you want to do is destroy this guy's life, hold this seat open and hope you win in 2020. Is there some truth to that criticism?
No, there isn't. But of course, that is exactly what you're going to expect the Republicans to say. We have a credible witness, and the Republicans don't deny that her testimony was very credible, very believable. They just don't want to get to the truth of it. And I think we saw also just what a political exercise this has become with the GOP when Kavanaugh, in his personally written open statement, basically blamed the Clintons for the predicament that he's in. Now, unless you think the Clintons somehow put Dr. Ford up to testify, then that testimony makes no sense whatsoever, unless you're just doing a blatant appeal to the Republican base.
If Kavanaugh is confirmed without any additional witnesses, what do you think that will do in terms of how he's viewed, in terms of his legitimacy?
Well, I think he's going to be tainted for whatever time he serves on the bench, whether he remains on the Court of Appeals or he's confirmed for the Supreme Court. It's not just the taint from this attack in high school, if you credit Dr. Ford's testimony, as I do, but the fact that on so many occasions in his Senate testimony, he appeared to be clearly untruthful, unwilling to acknowledge what he had written in his diary, what it meant, small lies, but nonetheless untruths said under oath about his drinking, about his social activities with his friends. He was unwilling to admit any of that. And so I think there's going to be a very fundamental lack of trust in this judge, whatever court he sits on.
Once again, he did emphatically deny all those allegations. I want to move on at this point and ask you about Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein as well. President Trump plans to meet with him next week to discuss his future after the New York Times reported that he had suggested secretly recording the president. He had brought up the issue of possibly removing him from office under the 25th Amendment. Rosenstein has denied the report. So what do you think his future should be?
I think he should stay there and protect the Mueller investigation. And what disturbs me about this is it may be degenerating into a question of when the president gets rid of Rod Rosenstein. The Republicans in Congress are urging him to get rid of Rosenstein, but they're urging him to wait until after the midterms, when his obvious effort to obstruct the investigation won't force them to pay a political price at the polls. But nonetheless, they've made it clear they want him out of there. And that ought to alarm all of us, because right now he's the only thing protecting the Mueller investigation. And so he needs to stay at his post. And there's been some reporting that he's willing to resign as long as the president doesn't say bad things about it. That, I think, is completely unacceptable.
All right. Also in Washington today, Google's chief executive Sundar Pichai is meeting with House Republicans to discuss complaints that the company is trying to suppress conservative views. This is something that has been leveled at other tech companies as well. Do you think that social media companies are dampening free speech?
I haven't seen any evidence of a political bias in terms of how the social media platforms operate or how their algorithms are structured. It's certainly true that a great many people on the Hill may not like the political views of people who work for Google, but the employees of Google are entitled to their own First Amendment rights like everyone else. So I think these claims of bias in how the platforms operate are bogus. I think it's part of an effort to somehow get the platforms to prejudice their content in favor of conservative views. And I certainly don't think that Google or any other tech company ought to be bullied into doing that.
There have been questions, though, about the size of these companies. Google has 90% of the global search market. Facebook has billions of users. Are you concerned about their size and their dominance? Do they need to have additional regulations?
You know, I think it's certainly a legitimate policy issue for the Congress to look into, whether there's such a concentration of market power in a handful of companies that it is stifling either competition or innovation or having other adverse policy impacts. I think we should do oversight on the issue and not prejudge where it leads us. But I think those are very legitimate questions to ask.
All right. Congressman Adam Schiff joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Now to the California governor's race. With about 5 weeks to go until Election Day, a new poll from the Public Policy Institute of California shows the race for governor is tightening. Among likely voters, Democrat Gavin Newsom leads Republican John Cox by 12 points. The two candidates differ over a host of issues, including immigration and whether to repeal the gas tax. As part of our election coverage, KQED Politics senior editor Scott Shafer sat down with Lieutenant Governor Newsom earlier.
Lieutenant Governor Newsom, good to have you.
Good to be here.
I want to begin by talking about the story that has riveted the country this week, and that is the hearings with Brett Kavanaugh and Blasey Ford. What's the most important takeaway for you from all of this, not just this week?
How divided and polarized we are as a country, fundamentally. How we're talking past each other. Almost get a sense it doesn't matter what either side says. It is not a great moment in our history.
A part of the conversation with Brett Kavanaugh was his schooling, and he went to Catholic schools, as you did.
Yeah.
You talked about your Catholic faith. And, of course, the church, again, is embroiled in this abuse scandal. And I'm just wondering if you feel like California should join New York and New Jersey and do an independent investigation of abuse by not just priests, but also employees.
Well, I grew up in the church. I would have no trouble with that whatsoever, at all. Anecdotally, and directly. I don't want to manifest any intrigue on my own experiences, but as an altar boy and those early childhood memories. But yeah, I think that is absolutely appropriate under the circumstance. And there's no additional moral threshold that you can advance because you sit there at communion and somehow can be forgiven of those sins. You need to be held accountable for them.
Let's talk about your campaign for governor.
Good. It's much easier.
Your campaign, it's changed a little bit, but the slogan, but it's basically courage for a change, and with a period after courage now. It sort of implies that maybe Jerry Brown didn't have courage on some issues, or that you're going to have different priorities. Talk about that. How will you be different from Jerry Brown in terms of those priorities?
I think, look, I'm not here to critique Jerry Brown. Actually, I want to compliment him. I mean, he's a master politician. He did an extraordinary job. He's the right person at the right time. He triaged this state. He has put us back on firm footing. That said, there are vexing issues in this state that are going to require courage, and it is going to require a change in terms of approach. The homeless issue is out of control. It's inexcusable. It's unacceptable. 24% of the nation's homeless, 134,000 people on the streets and sidewalks. We need to address that. The housing issue, the affordability crisis in this state, mortgages, rents, they're out of control. We're 49th out of 50th in per capita housing units. It's going to require a different strategy, a different framework, and that's what I'm arguing for.
When you were mayor, of course, homelessness was an issue, a big issue. It still is. You tried to tackle it with Care Not Cash and some other things. And as you well know, you can take 5,000 people off the streets and get them in housing, and there's going to be another 5,000 people, often from other counties or other states. And so how do you deal with that on a regional or statewide basis? Do you have to hold these counties accountable?
I love your question because you're framing it as it needs to be framed. It's a national problem manifesting in the state. It's a state problem manifesting in regions manifesting in the cities. A city mayor cannot solve this his or herself. You've got to regionalize strategies. And what I mean by regionalizing is accountability. If San Francisco is the only one in the entire 9-county Bay Area that's doing all the right things, that's going to place enormous pressure on the city and county of San Francisco, and that pressure needs to be equally shared.
How do you apply that pressure?
Regional plans, regional strategies, incentivize good behavior, disincentivize bad behavior. We laid out literally a dozen specific strategies to address these issues. We want a cabinet secretary, a homeless czar of sorts. I want to be held accountable with timelines, objectives, and real deliverables, and regionalizing strategies to help support local efforts.
You've also made child care and universal preschool for all California kids a priority. Why is that so important?
0 to 3, 85% of the brain is formed by the time you're 3. You need prenatal focus. You need early Head Start focus. Nurse home visits for first-time mothers. The power of reading to your kids, talking to your kids, counting and singing to your kids. That's not a government program. That's an educational strategy. The achievement gap starts before you enter kindergarten. If we're going to get serious about education reform, criminal justice reform, you've got to begin at the beginning, and that's a big part of our emphasis.
You're doing that. I'm not sure what the price tag is, but you've also talked about universal or single-payer health care, which has a big, big price tag. Vermont tried it. They gave up. Bernie Sanders' home state. So, how are you going to pay for it, and what do you need to do to actually make it happen?
I think the difference here between that effort in Vermont and what we're experiencing here in California is we're already spending, at least according to UCLA, $367.5 billion a year already on healthcare. By some estimates, it's over $400 billion. We have a population larger than 163 nations. We have a robust healthcare delivery system in this state. We truly are a nation state. And so my core belief is in an expenditure that's roughly 70-ish% single payer financed already, that we can address that remaining 30% and address the anxiety, the waste, and inefficiency in a multi-payer system. It's bankrupting the state. Healthcare is bankrupting the state of California. The next governor has to have a plan on healthcare. You can't escape it. We've seen huge premium increases. The ACA has been vandalized by Trump and the Trump administration. The end of the individual mandate, the introduction of these junk plans, skinny plans, increasing premiums for the rest of us. I'm committed, I think, to making sense of a single-payer financing approach.
One of the criticisms of Democrats generally, even from some other Democrats, say in the middle part of the country, is that there are too many coastal elites, is the phrase that they use, who talk down to the rural parts of the country, the red states, the flyover states. Yeah. And you could say that if you're living in, Redding or, Tuolumne County or any of those counties up north and to the east. What do you are caricatured as, the Tesla driving Davos.
Yeah, the irony
guy.
is I talk about this all the time because I agree with that. And I think we have to be very careful, Democrats, never to talk down to anyone. Quite the contrary. I mean, everyone wants to be universally protected, connected, respected. You talk down to someone, you're not respecting them. People want to be connected in many different ways, forms. And look, I grew up a very interesting reality. I had a divorced mom living here in the city, San Francisco, but my dad living in one of the reddest parts of California, Placer County. And so I have a deep appreciation and sensitivity to folks living in rural California. It's a big part of my life.
A couple of issues that come to mind around this is the environment, greening. You hear in coal country, they're afraid of clean energy. Gas tax, that kind of thing. Yeah. I mean, so bring it down to the reality as being governor. I mean, what do you say to folks who live in those parts of the state?
I've never met anyone that wants to turn on their tap and have brown water coming out or toxic water. I've never met anyone who wants to go outside, bring their kids to school, breathing dirty air. So I think you're talking in those terms. They may not believe in quote unquote global warming, which I remember was part of the vernacular. Now it's climate change. It's a hoax, man-made or otherwise. You get into those debates, you might lose folks. But if you focus on those fundamental issues, I think you can bring people back into the broader fold.
If you're elected, how is California going to be different in 4 years than it is today?
Well, I hope we can address this issue, the issue of our time, outside the existential issue of climate change, the issue of wealth disparity and income disparity, social mobility, the California dream, 19% supplemental poverty index in the state. It is unacceptable. It cannot be the wealthiest and the poorest state.
More taxes then?
No, it's not about taxes. And for me, it's about real strategies to address these issues. The 0 to 3 is a long-term strategy, dealing more with the earned income tax credit, other strategies that we've laid out. But again, these are 4 8-year plans. Nothing can happen overnight to address the crisis of affordability. But hopefully, over the course of a term, I think we'll have made real progress in these spaces.
Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom, thanks so much for coming in.
Good to be here.
Now to tech. Today, Facebook reveals that a hacker had gained access to nearly 50 million user accounts. It's just the latest in a host of problems, including the proliferation of fake accounts and misinformation on sites like Facebook, Google, and Twitter. Now, a new nonprofit news organization is taking aim at the power of tech companies and their impact on our lives. Launching next year, the Markup will be led by journalists from ProPublica who pioneered the use of data to reveal the discriminatory effects of software. This week, the founder of Craigslist, Craig Newmark, donated $20 million to help their effort. Joining me now in the studio is the managing editor for the Markup, Jeff Larson. And via Skype from her office in New York City is editor-in-chief Julia Angwin. Welcome to you both.
Great to be here.
Jeff, you say the Markup will be investigating the tech industry. How will you get the data you need? Because I would imagine that companies like Facebook and Google, for example, will not be handing over anything anytime soon.
It is a challenging problem. They're not known for their openness in terms of sharing data. So what we will do is we will hire programmers to work hand in hand with journalists to collect data from these closed systems. Some of the ways that we do that, and we have done it in the past in our work at ProPublica, is we'll create browser browser extensions that collect that data from, say, people's Facebook feeds or from these lockdown systems. So it will be really important that we collect this data so that we can go to these companies and present our findings.
And say, this is what we found.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
And Julia, why do you think this level of scrutiny is needed right now?
Well, you know, it's not just the tech industry that we think of that needs scrutiny, but just generally tech in society. You know, some of the stuff that Jeff and I have written about is the technology, the software that's used in courts for criminal sentencing, which we found was biased against Black defendants. So tech is being used as an instrument of power, essentially. It's a way to for people in power to implement the decisions that they've made. And so we want to look into those systems and find out, for instance, why is the algorithm flagging some people for more scrutiny at the airport than others, right? These are all embedded in computer systems, and we don't have a lot of insight into them. And I think we as the public deserve to know how these decisions are being made. And
you've also made the comparison in the past to the canned food industry. Can you explain that?
Yes. I mean, you know, it's a sort of a silly analogy, but I think it makes sense. You know, the thing is that when canned food came out, everybody was so excited because you could have peaches in the summer and in the winter when you couldn't used to have them. And so there were 30 years where all the recipes had canned food. And I think that's how we are now with technology. It's so exciting. We all have a supercomputer in our pocket, and we've been in love with these machines, and we haven't really questioned their influence and how they're making decisions. And I think we're kind of just now waking up to the fact that they're changing the way we interact with each other, the way we interact as a society, and starting to investigate, well, what does that mean, and can we mitigate some of the downsides of it?
And Jeff, what will be some of the main investigative areas you will focus on for the markup?
I think what we're looking at is the place that technology and algorithms have in our lives, have control in our lives. So not just the large tech companies and the ways in which, you know, information is spread and shared in today's world, but also algorithms that have decisions over regular folks' lives. So Julia mentioned parole decisions. We'll also be looking into car insurance, for example. These technologies that are used to classify and rank and score folks, people don't necessarily think of them when they think of technology, but they are being used with little to no oversight, and we're here to provide that oversight.
And I know, Julia, that when you were with ProPublica, another investigative news site, one of the other investigative areas you looked at was how numerous companies use Facebook to only target young people in job ads. Facebook has argued that federal law gives it immunity from liability for what people place on their sites in terms of ads and other third-party content. Do you think these companies should be held responsible for what people put on their platforms?
Well, it's a question, you know, the courts will probably have to consider. But, you know, the fact is there's never been an easier or better way to discriminate online, honestly, right? I mean, in the past, if you wanted to advertise only to younger workers, or actually it used to be, for instance, that the ads would say, you know, no women or only men apply, no blacks. Right now, you can do it without anyone knowing, because you can just buy a targeted ad on Facebook. And until recently, they had a drop-down menu, which was like, don't show this ad to these people. And you could actually block out groups you didn't want to see it. So there's never been a better way to discriminate. And it's really a question of, like, what do we as a society want to allow? Let's say that it is legal. I think the courts will decide that. But we also have to think about what we want to be legal. We are the citizens, and we theoretically have some input into what's allowable.
So Julia has raised some interesting questions right there. You know, for you, what are the biggest worries about technology and its future impact?
I think we're quickly going into a situation, and have been there for the past couple decades, where technology is used for automated decisions, right? And that means that these algorithms are used to rank and score people, are making decisions on behalf of people's lives that impact their lives, and there's little to no recourse for challenging it. You can't sit down and argue with a computer. In fact, some of these algorithms, the people who put them into practice don't even know how they work. right? Don't even understand. But
you saying the engineers themselves sometimes don't understand the total broad reach and consequences of what they work on?
Yeah, I think we've seen that not only with Google in recent weeks, but with Facebook during the election. I don't think that there was sort of like a deep understanding knowledge of how disinformation can spread on these platforms. I think we're coming to terms with that now, but I also think on a more local level, on a more impactful of people's lives, that when you're scored and you're ranked dangerous, but you don't go on to commit another crime, there's no recourse for you, right? You can't stand up in court and argue against that algorithm. If the algorithm is fed bad data, you can't correct that data beforehand. You can't, the decision is final.
And so for so long, the company's arguments have been, well, we didn't do that. The algorithm did it. So it's like, is that a way of shifting responsibility, Julia?
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge, that it's often these algorithms are built to sort of teach themselves, through machine learning, or what now we talk about as artificial intelligence. And so they just learn off of the existing data sets. And the truth is, our society is not perfect. So some of our data sets are also biased, and the decisions we've made in the past are biased. So what happens is those biases get entrenched and automated. And then, as Jeff said, it's very hard to dispute them. So like, what is the due process for you? How do you argue in court against an algorithm that's decided you're more risky than another person who was arrested? And so that's the challenge of this automated world that we're entering. And what we want to do is provide at least some counterpoint, some independent oversight of some of those algorithms.
And Jeff, there's also the problem of data breaches. Facebook today announced that a hacker gained access to nearly 50 million user accounts. This isn't the first time data breaches have happened. So what are the top things that you think people should know about how tech companies use their data and affects their lives every day?
Julia and the other, in 2011, did a story called, a series of stories that was, it got a Pulitzer nod, called What They Know, which was essentially just laying out data brokers and the ways in which our data travel across various different companies. One of the things that we want to do in the markup is pick back up that work in 2018 and look at the ways in which your data travels from a data broker like Experian, goes to Facebook, maybe goes to Twitter or Google, and ways in which that is not necessarily ideal.
Right.
And when these breaches come, breaches happen, and they will continue to happen, shining some lights on how that data works.
All right. You will launch next year. Jeff Larson and Julia Angwin with the new news outlet, The Markup. Thank you both for your time.
Thank you. So much.
And that will do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Thank you for joining us.